We're moving on now to chapter 7 in your textbook, where we're going to be looking at structuralism, semiotics, and post-structuralism. And on page 220, he writes, structuralism and semiotics are related theoretical approaches developed for the most part by 20th century French theorists. Both of them focused first on the nature of language, but were later applied to culture and society. They are popular in anthropology and literary and cultural studies and have important repercussions for social theory. So that's absolutely true, and really hats off to him to corral all of this into this chapter. It's almost impossible to bring this all together in a way that makes any kind of sense. But I do think it's important to note that, as he says, this really had more impact in literary cultural studies and anthropology than in sociology, partly because, and I'm just going to state my bias here. I find a lot of this theory really unnecessarily confusing, and so I'm not going to be doing hardcore testing on a lot of this. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really very concerned with us looking in depth at theory that we can apply to the world around us, that allows us to ask important questions. And so I was very impressed by the work you did on the last assignment of applying McLuhan and Menzies to the world around us. Now, I don't know if this is maybe the fact that in a Canadian setting, what's considered central is perhaps different. I don't know. There is such a thing as Canadian pragmatism. I'm probably the least pragmatic Canadian, but still, part of me is like, it's got to have some use. And so you could see in that assignment that applying that theory allows you to critique what's going on around you. And that in turn, it is happening, can lead to policy change and to change in the real world. So as I was developing this lecture, I came across something in the Globe and Mail, and it was a sort of a piece in the Globe and Mail about Linton Red Wilson. So it says, McMaster remembers a great Canadian. And I had come across this, there was this amazing project at McMaster University where it was called the Socrates Project. And so Wilson had endowed all this money to allow for this program to ask big questions about society and how to make it better. And so I found out from reading this that actually he also endowed the largest ever gift in support of the liberal arts, which allowed us to launch the Wilson College for Leadership and Civic Engagement at McMaster. So I'm just positioning myself here in where I sit and stand as a academic, that this is more my concern, that we can be civically engaged within our communities, within our families, within our country, within the international order. And unfortunately, some of this theory is not doing that from my point of view. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting things to think about. Now, the other thing about this is it gives me flashbacks to grad school. So when I was in grad school, this was de rigueur, all of this theory. And I felt a tremendous amount of pressure to use it in my work, even though it has no bearing on my work. And so I have my own axe to grind with all of this. It since seems to have disappeared almost without a trace. But if you look back on writing from the 90s and early 2000s, it's everywhere. So there are fads in academia, just like there are fads everywhere else, apparently. And I went to a conference many years ago now, and there was a Russian scholar there who worked on shamanism, and he said that during the Soviet Union, they used to use postmodern theory as a kind of code to get material out of the Soviet Union. So that kind of made more sense to me, that maybe it's a code. And the academic actually said, it gives you like an instant migraine. So anyway, I've given you a lot of reading for this section. So I'm just going to highlight the sections that I think are most relevant from this material. My understanding of this is that, other than Foucault's been very influential, a lot of this has much less influence in sociology. Now, again, if you had a different professor, maybe they would present this differently. But that's how I'm seeing it. So you can make your own decisions. Obviously, if you want to work on one of these thinkers, you are welcome to do that. That's what university is. We can have all different opinions about things, and as long as you can back them up, that's fine. So don't feel restricted in that way. If you find this fascinating, you want to work on it, you're welcome to do so. Mann starts the first section of this chapter with Ferdinand de Saussure and Claude Lévi-Strauss. And Saussure is the founder of the school of structural linguistics and semiotics. And I think because this is so complicated, that Mann has used a really, I think, very helpful graphic here on page 221 of your textbook, which is of an iceberg. So what he's getting at with that image is the idea that there's surface phenomenon and then deep structures. And so he gives the example of Saussure. The surface phenomenon would be spoken words and sentences. The deep structure would be the structures of the language. So out of that deep structure of language, we then speak out of it. If I was a Freudian, the surface phenomenon might be myths, jokes, slips of the tongue, but the deep structure will be the unconscious. Okay, so it depends on the thinker how they're completely understanding this. And so he talks about Saussure's idea of the sign and the signifier, and this has launched many a discourse. And I'll just repeat what he's saying here. Human languages are made up of signs, each of which has two elements: a given linguistic term, a sign, the union of a written mark or sound, the signifier, and the idea or concept it represents, the signifier. That itself seems fairly straightforward. So the idea that in English, I say cat, the word cat itself has no particular meaning. In another language, it would be a different word. So he's also given a graphic for that on the next page. So the idea of a language as a unified system to which we in our culture give a meaning is probably one of his most influential ideas. So on page 223, he writes, Saussure's structuralism was also important in that it looked at language as a total system that must already exist in order for human beings to create meaning within it. Okay, so he then looks at Lévi-Strauss, who I learned about actually in anthropology, and some of his most important works are the elementary structures of kinship, structural anthropology, and I think his most famous is the raw and the cooked. And so he takes on board some of Saussure's ideas. So he writes that myth is like a structural language that gets replayed over and over again in different cultures. And he looks at things like the incest taboo, totemism, and so on. Now, this part, we have to be very careful. And so the idea of imposing this in other cultures can get us into trouble, I think. So this is basically saying these deep structures exist in all cultures. I think there's some truth to that. But I do think this can get pretty gruesome. Like I've seen works that try to apply Freud to India or to Hinduism, for instance, and it gets very, very strange and colonial when you start to do that. So I'm going to move on now to looking at a person whose work I'm more comfortable with and that I understand better, I think, which is Joseph Campbell. So Joseph Campbell is an American theorist who takes on board some of these ideas of surface phenomena and deep structures and takes it in his own direction. Now, I just want to add in here that Campbell was influenced by Carl Jung, who apparently his name cannot be uttered. I've never understood this, why you can't utter the name of Jung. I said in a different lecture that I think it's related to the fact that he's often perceived as a kind of a mystic, and that's not permitted. So I don't know, but I know for a fact that Campbell was influenced by Jung. And so as he says in your textbook 224, for him, the basis, so he says, Campbell convincingly argues that all the great mythical sagas are based on one story, the monomyth. This monomyth is the hero's journey, which has a rough and ready common structure of stages in myths taken from a wide variety of cultures. I don't think it's the only myth, but it's certainly a really important one and one that's instantly recognizable to people. Now, Campbell was able to do what almost no one in the Academy is able to do. I've talked about this, which is become a bestseller. So his books are still in print. They're read. I've met so many people who have read Joseph Campbell. And so, like Marshall McLuhan, and even more so, his work has gone out in a kind of a popular way. He's published by non-academic presses that sell, thousands and thousands of books. So his ideas have been spread very widely, and I'm going to look at some of the ways in which that's come into our culture. So when we're looking at Campbell's probably his most famous idea of the hero's journey, we can look at how this idea of a deep structure works. And so the story is that the creators of Star Wars, George Lucas, I believe it is, read Campbell and developed Star Wars based on Campbell, which makes sense if you've seen the film. So, Mann spends quite a lot of time in your textbook on this. I'll look through it a little bit here. I'm going to attach a short video by Winkler, which is excellent, where he does this kind of animated synopsis of the hero's journey that I think shows it really, really well and very clearly. So what I find fascinating about this and what I find convincing about this is that you can read or watch let's just look at film for this example. And you can show it anywhere in the world and people will recognize the story. So if I show Lord of the Rings, I think anywhere in the world, people will know immediately what that's about. And also, if I have watched Hindu dramas like the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, I recognize it in that case, that the hero looks very similar. Now, it'll vary, so that there is cultural context. So, for instance, some of you have read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and if we look at the Greek hero, it's always a bit strange to look at Greek heroes. I remember when I first was reading them, I'm like, they're not very nice people. They're not very moral, So that version of heroism looks slightly different, but still, it's the idea of physical bravery, right? All of those elements are still there. They'll be slightly different. So if we look at Lord of the Rings, the figure of Aragorn is a moral. There's a kind of a Christian influence there through Tolkien, and so he's a moral leader and hero. So they will look slightly different, and certainly if we look at Luke Skywalker, his concerns are very specific more to our time period. So as he says on page 25 of your textbook, there's three major parts to the hero's journey, which is departure, initiation, and return. Okay, and then he builds it out. Campbell builds it out. So I'm going to use Lord of the Rings for my explanation here. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing because I'm giving you that clip, but I'll just touch on some of it. So the idea that departure. So number one, the call to adventure. The call to adventure is the point in the future hero's life when he is told that things are about to change radically. He is called to leave his home by some herald or message. Okay? And so if we think to Lord of the Rings, the first part of it in the film version, this is where we see Frodo. He's just this happy little hobbit. He's living in this kind of paradisical kind of community. He's completely comfortable. He's a little restless, that's all. But then Gandalf comes in, the ring comes in, and he has this call that he has to answer. And I find a very moving part where he and Sam step outside the Shire, and he stops and he says, "This is the furthest from home I've ever been." And so, sorry, I'm sort of skipping ahead here to the crossing of the first threshold. So, if we want to look at what that looks like in a human life, and psychologists will often use this kind of language to work with people. If you're the hero in your own life, what does that mean to leave home, to leave what we're comfortable with? So let's look at it as an undergraduate. When you go to university, for many of you, you leave home for the first time. So that idea of leaving what's comfortable, leaving what's known in order to develop and grow as a person, right? So partly what is behind this is that we can all identify with this hero and the necessity of leaving what home symbolizes and moving out into the world and going through all these tests and trials. So I won't go through the whole thing, but the idea of supernatural aid. So in the saga of Arthur, it's Merlin. In Lord of the Rings, it's Gandalf. In Star Wars, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi. So this kind of, certainly with Gandalf and Obi-Wan Kenobi, they're this, you can even see in the way they're dressed, they're this sort of pure being of who's bringing aid to the hero and giving them counsel. And so we get into the second section, which is the initiation, where the hero has to go through a series of trials. And this often includes physical trials of combat, but it's also mental trials of doubt, self-doubt, and so on. And then the next section is return. And so that idea of trying to take back, the hero has to take back what they've learned. So they will attempt to go back home. So I think this is shown really movingly in Lord of the Rings, that Frodo goes back to the Shire, but he's completely changed. And so in that completely, I don't know, he could not seem to edit it, but what was trying to be an ending, he has to leave the Shire again because he's just been so changed by his journey. But that's that one specific story. And I think it's a very contemporary story in that way. But the idea of the cultural hero having to bring back what that person has discovered back to their culture, and so often that idea of you're returning home, but you're completely changed by that journey. Before leaving this section, I did want to touch on something, which is the idea of the heroine's journey. And when I was looking at this book again by Maureen Murdoch, she has a whole section in the beginning of the book where she was an actual student of Joseph Campbell, and she said to him, "What about the woman's journey?" And apparently Campbell said, "There's no such thing. The woman just sits there and waits, and the hero does all the action." So as you can imagine, she wasn't too pleased with that answer, and she was living at the time of second wave feminism, and so she developed the idea of the heroine's journey, which I found very interesting. And so I was actually attending an online lecture just recently where the person presenting was talking about myths of the feminine, and kind of laughing because in a lot of the myths, it doesn't look like the hero's journey. It's not like hacking things with a sword. There's a lot of sitting in the wilderness and waiting. And if we look at the journey of Psyche, for instance, the sorting of the seeds, she's given all these tests by Aphrodite, where she has to sort the seeds. She has to try to do these very challenging tasks, retrieving the golden fleece and so on. But nonetheless, the structure is still there of the persistence that's necessary, the bravery, and also the idea of divine aid. So when she's given these seemingly impossible tasks, nature and kind of divine aid comes to her. So I just wanted to add this in here. I think this was certainly up until very recently not a concern. However, we've seen things like the Hunger Games, for instance, where we have a female heroine, and in that case, she does have to go into physical combat. So I do think it depends, or Mulan, right? So the more feminine look at that archetype of the hero. Now we move on to Roland Barthes, who Mann talks about on page 231, starting on page 231 in the Semiotics of Popular Culture. And so in this context, myth is being used quite differently. And so, as Mann writes, as we have seen, semiotics is the idea that language and culture are systems of signs or codes. Roland Barthes pioneered the application of semiotics to popular culture, seeing films, novels, clothes, music, and images in magazines as such symbols. Semiotics has the advantage over structuralism of being able to deal with signs as historically and culturally located, so they're not just the same for all cultures at all times. So this becomes a way that we can analyze media. And so we've already talked about this in the section on Marshall McLuhan and media, but there are obviously many ways we can look at media. And I asked you to, it was kind of a Barthian analysis I was asking you to do of that truck commercial earlier in the course. And so Barthes also was influenced by Marxism, and so it's very similar to what Marx would have meant by ideology. And so he talks about the idea in which sort of bourgeois modes of society are taken as just reality. So that, so he says, in this sense, what Barthes calls myth is like a meta-language that uses other languages to express meaning. Yet Barthes had a more explicitly political purpose in his semiology. Exposing the cultural myths of bourgeois society, he argues that just as myths are language, they are also depoliticized speech where the politics is hidden. So the example given is this very famous image from the magazine Paris Match. And so this is a image of a soldier. And so he discusses this at the bottom of page 31. Barthes argues that the power of a myth like that of the Paris Match cover lies in the fact that its reader sees the ideologically motivated connection between the image and French imperialism. So, so this is his most famous analysis, where he's showing a picture of a black colonial soldier. So the idea that this soldier is reverently saluting the French flag. So how do we read this semiotically? Then we would say that particularly somebody in France is reading this as, they might not necessarily think this consciously, but the idea that colonialism is a good thing, the colonized like it, they're participating in it. And so we need to also know the context that France was involved in empire and was fighting a colonial war with Algeria in this period when Barthes is writing. And so in a sense, this image is a way to try to calm the water by saying, we're not an empire. This isn't an immoral war. This is, we're part of a larger project, and the people in these countries actually participate in it. So Barthes is asking us to look really critically at media, and this is certainly something that I'm very concerned, and I think that this is a role that the Academy can really play in our day and age, of getting us to look at the internet, on influencers on the internet, newspapers, radio, all of it, to listen to it critically and understand it as presenting a certain ideology. And I've talked already in this course about the way we need to know who owns Paris Match at this time and what are their politics. Because I'll just give an example. The Washington Post was bought by Jeff Bezos, and he shut down the editorial board when Trump was running for president. So we need to know the politics behind these images, and I do think we're not as critical when it comes to images. And in my religion courses, I talk about this, the way in which other religious traditions are, other than Christianity, are presented, for instance. And even Christianity sometimes is presented in a negative way. But particularly if we look at the way, for instance, Islam is presented in mainstream media, the pictures are very particular. They often show people in groups. They often show them looking like they're on the verge of a riot. So these aren't coincidental. There's a certain language that's being deployed. So this is these are the cultural myths that sort of the colonies as a civilizing mission, quote unquote, for instance, that are being are the subtext to these kind of images. We're moving on now to the Birmingham School and the Semiotics of Style on page 233, and this is a group of thinkers coming out of University of Birmingham in the UK, their Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which Mann describes as a heady hybrid of Gramsci's Marxism and Barth's semiotics. And so the main theorists being Phil Cohen, Stuart Hall, Dick Hebdige, John Clark, Tony Jefferson, and Angela McRobbie. And so their theory of subcultural deviance was specifically applied to the British experience after the World War II, although it could be adapted to other contexts. The Birmingham School members were neo-Marxists with a semiotic twist. Wow. And so this group of thinkers is taking these theories of semiotics and applying them into culture, and also looking at class and how that works out in a class context. So on page 235, the Birmingham School saw subcultural resistances as taking place within the realms of popular culture, consumption, and leisure. Working class youths resisted bourgeois values through subcultural rituals, dress, slang, and music, offering magical solutions to real class contradictions. So this is kind of a rejection of bourgeois values that, as Barth has said, are kind of in the myths around us. So that might express itself in modes of dress. And so I think many of you will be familiar with what a punk leather coat would shave their head. And for a woman to do that, it's even more countercultural, sort of rejecting those ideas of femininity. And just to give you this, the image I'm showing here is of the Clash. So music was a huge, huge part of this movement, and a lot of these, certainly the Clash was extremely political as well. The Sex Pistols are a strange example because they were almost made up by their promoter. But if we look at their first album, it was extremely critical of the monarchy. It was critical of mainstream music and so on. So this is very kind of rebellious countercultural approach. And as he alludes to in here, this is a tricky way to do it. Certainly there's many versions of this. I talk sometimes about the way the Wicca movement, neo-pagan movement, and the way people dress becomes a kind of marker of counterculture, where they're dressing in this medieval style, rejecting modernity in that way. I think the weaknesses in this as a political move are there's a number of them, but which is it's very hard for this not to get co-opted by the mainstream. And so, for example, this album by The Clash, huge best-selling album, makes the musicians very wealthy, and then, they're less, obviously less countercultural as a result. Not always the case. Obviously, some musicians maintain their political. You can look at Neil Young; he's maintained it throughout his life, but that's rare. And so we also see. You do wonder if there's somebody behind this who's just like, this is too dangerous, let's just take it into the mainstream. And so I remember in the early 90s when you would suddenly start to see just everybody was wearing these kind of mass-produced chains that were imitating punk fashion, but you could buy it, at the local clothing store. And at that point, the movement's dead. So this is often what happens with these. They start with a lot of energy, and they're actually seen as threatening by the mainstream, but oftentimes they get co-opted through kind of capitalism and consumerism. But that doesn't negate the fact that they're making they're offering a sustained criticism of mainstream society. we are now moving towards postmodernism, and as I said earlier in the lecture, this hit its high water mark in I would say, the 1990s and early 2000s. And kudos to Mann for trying to make a chart out of this. So he starts on page 237, and this is actually helpful. So he calls it Mapping Postmodernism on page 239. So that'll give you some idea of the overarching umbrella of all of this, because it's so fragmented. I mean, the fact that it's fragmented is the medium is the message. That's how it sees the world, which is another reason why I had so many arguments in grad school about this. So just to give an example here, the postmodern condition, the critique of the Enlightenment reason, and the incredulity towards meta-narratives. So the idea that you're taking apart these ideas of the Enlightenment of any form of meaning. So he looks at it in the realm of pop culture, where we see irony, pastiche, self-referencing, and recycling. We see it in architecture. We see it in art, which is true. I mean, as we get these cultural movements, they express themselves in all areas of culture. So on page 340, he talks about the fragmentation of the self and the death of the author. Now, this was one. The idea of you can't say that somebody wrote something. This is how I just find this mystifying. So are texts writing themselves? I do not understand. So let's just look at what Mann has to say here. 240. The fragmentation of the self in Western thought can be traced at least to the late 19th century in the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. Aha. So all roads lead to Nietzsche. So I'm consistent, if nothing else. A relentless critic of almost all the major theoretical systems of the day. So this is a movement of deconstruction, of taking apart. So this is the opposite of the idea of that underneath everything are these structures of the mind and of culture. This is the idea that there's nothing. You're just taking it apart. So my question was always like, A, why would you do that? And B, what is your aim in doing that? Because to me, if you're saying that there's no person and there's no author, then it's chaos. And how's that helping? How's that even an analysis? So I would just say that fragmentation is the hallmark of this, and it's partly why I react against it. I'd have to be such a hypocrite to be in the academy and say there's no meaning and there's no structure. I mean, that was one of my arguments, was then you need to leave the academy, because if there's no point then in writing anything or arguing anything. So we see it in the title, The End of Truth. So we're getting into really rocky territory here. If there's no truth and there's no meaning, then we're talking about what Nietzsche said, anything is permissible, and that's we're getting into trouble here. So I will leave it at that. So on page 244, they talk about the idea of taking apart the canon and the meta-narratives. And this we'll see this when we get into some of the later parts of the course, which are legitimate complaints. The idea of the literary canon and the way in which it expresses a certain, only the views of a certain group, right? So the canon doesn't, for instance, I already touched on this, look at the lives of women. It doesn't look at the lives of people that come from places other than Europe. So these are legitimate critiques. But what I question is the larger kind of deconstruction of everything. So I want to turn now to looking at Michel Foucault, who is probably, I would say, the most influential, and who would not, I don't think, have considered himself a postmodernist, actually. And we can see very clearly with Foucault that his work comes out of his own, as it does with everybody, but the idea of his own lived experience. He was gay, and living in the time period in which he did, he ended up going to a psychiatrist, and actually made an attempt at suicide. So we can see this experience he had with medicine and the medical establishment and the way that pathologized homosexuality, the impression it made on him, and how it shaped his later work. We can see that very clearly. And so one of his very important works was on what do we mean when we talk about insanity, for instance. And so we've looked at this in terms of Goffman and asylums, and he was looking at it through a slightly different lens. So Michel Foucault is very concerned with how this comes down into the individual. So he wrote Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason in 1961. And this was a hugely popular text. So Foucault, again, is somebody people even outside of the academy read Foucault. He's been that influential. And so one of the original things he does here is he looks at madness as a historical artifact. So that what we mean by madness in the medieval period is different to what we mean by madness currently. Now, the meaning of madness is in flux. So it went through a period about 20, 30 years ago that it's chemical imbalances in the brain. It's gone through all of these different iterations. And this is an example where people do think it's reality, and people can get very angry if you question their understanding of it. So just to use this as an example, on page 252 of your textbook, he talks about the pre-modern episteme. In the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the mad were tolerated, even seen as divinely inspired. Their madness was a path to supernatural wisdom. Look at how the mad are pictured in Shakespeare's plays for evidence of this view. Madness is seen as a sort of spiritually inspired fall from grace, such as a fool of God. So this is very interesting, right? And this is something I've experienced when I've taught courses or sections of courses on mysticism, that from the contemporary view, mysticism is insanity. And again, this is why Jung gets written out of everything, because any form of mysticism is viewed by many people as insanity. So I think Foucault just makes such an important kind of point here that these things change over time. And so in the classical episteme, later in the classical age, from 1650 to 1800, Foucault argues that madness was seen as a sort of unreason, a descent into animality that had to be restrained by or hidden from rational society. So we talked about this at the very beginning of the course, the idea of the Enlightenment being all about reason and the rational. And that's what makes particularly a man a human being. And so madness really threatens that paradigm, and so it has to be dealt with severely. This age starts with the Great Confinement in the mid-17th century of the mad, the unemployed, libertines, and other undesirables. The insane were now left to rot in the dark prisons once occupied by lepers. So this is brilliant. This is brilliant analysis. It's absolutely true. So they have to be institutionalized. So that leads into Goffman. So the development of those institutions that occur at this time period. So after the medieval period, we start to see what we would call insane asylums. Now that has changed again in our time, where we've seen a huge movement away from that, but that would be kind of the coming out of the Enlightenment period. The modern episteme, later, after the insane were liberated, quote unquote, by modern psychological discourse, madness was seen as a treatable illness, a disease to be cured by skilled doctors. This regime was initiated by Philippe Pinel in France and Samuel Tuke in America at the end of the 18th century. They freed the mad from their prisons, only to impose bourgeois notions of morality on the insane, whose descent to animal-like behavior was an affront to these norms. Okay, so they're all sounding terrible as reactions. Actually, the medieval one's sounding the best to me. I always think of that, I think it's Amarcord, the Fellini film, where the guy... he's just going around ranting and raving, and everybody in the community knows who he is and knows his family, and they're just, he's just part of the community. I think that's very much that sort of traditional view of this. Or you're just slightly eccentric, that kind of attitude towards it, rather than, for instance, that it's a disease to be treated. So in one of Foucault's most famous works, I would say probably his most famous, Discipline and Punish, published in 1975, he looks at the history of forms of punishment. And again, as he does with madness, he sees this as historical. And as many of you will know, if we look at England in certain parts of its history, you could be hung for stealing a rabbit, poaching a rabbit from somebody's land. So these things have changed. These things we think of unchanging have been changing all the time. depending who's in power and what they're trying to achieve. So he says here, but perhaps the most important effect of the carceral system and its extension well beyond legal imprisonment is that it succeeds in making the power to punish natural and legitimate. So he's asking the question, in certain time periods, who has the power to punish others? And so he looks at it, as I said, through history. In the days of the absolute monarchs, a crime was seen as an attack on the person of the king, a declaration of war on his sovereignty, so it was punished in public in a gory and spectacular way. And a colleague of mine who's a criminologist did a presentation for me. It was for an interview, and he was doing it for me, and he was talking about drawing and quartering. That was actually a punishment that they used to use, where they would attach your arms and legs to 4-horse. It's disgusting. And do it in public. And you probably know that the guillotine and hanging, often they were done in public, which just, it seems bizarre to us now. But that's not that long ago. That was true in Canada. It was obviously meant to frighten people into following the law. But certainly it's considered barbaric now. So this kind of spectacle or torture was permitted. So Mann writes, yet legal reformers in the later days of the French old regime and during the French Revolution helped put an end to punishment as public spectacle, since it was seen as inhumane. Even the guillotine was seen as a step in the right direction, since it was quick and relatively painless. I don't know about that. So Foucault starts to look at how modes of punishment and discipline, especially of the human body, change over time. So one of the most influential ideas emerging from Foucault's work is the panopticon, and some of you may have heard of this. One of you, in your paper, you used a source that talks about the panopticon in terms of social media. And so he writes on page 255, Foucault sees Jeremy Bentham's model of the ideal prison. What a thing to be working on, Bentham. The panopticon as a model for the disciplinary society. The panopticon has a central observation tower containing guards surrounded by circular banks of prison cells facing it, each with a window facing outside to let light in. They were well-lit little theaters of punishment. Since the cells all face the central tower, the prisoners never know when the guards are observing them, so they in theory regulate their own conduct. Foucault saw the panopticon as a metaphor for the disciplinary powers of contemporary institutions like the military, schools, prisons, and the clinic, all of which localize observation and graduate punishment within their claimed local bits of space and time through timetables, the correction of gestures, the enclosing and partitioning of space. Think of the modern factory or office. This is interesting in terms of the open concept office, which I think many of us are questioning now. I always questioned it. It's like, how are you supposed to work with all that noise? But certainly it's also that everybody can be seen at all times. That just occurred to me. That's very sinister. It's always presented as, isn't this amazing and freeing? But really, what is it achieving? It's that everybody gets to see the junk on your desk and the boss can see that you're not working. So he's using this panopticon as a kind of larger metaphor of the ways in which in contemporary society we might not be beaten or drawn and quartered, but we are disciplined in these other ways. We're disciplined through the way we're educated. I talked already about the way that certainly middle school and high school follows that factory model of everybody sitting at their desk, and then the bell rings, and then we move, and then we have a break for lunch, and then we go back. All of that structuring is very much coming out of the disciplining of the bodies and emotions of people. So Mann has a lot of criticism here. He at one point here on page 256, he says Foucault seems to be harboring nostalgia for the good old days of blood and guts public punishments where the prisoner was mentally free even if his body was in chains. I don't know about that. I don't know about that. And so he goes on to talk about how Foucault also wrote very famously about the history of sexuality. And as I said, because of his own homosexuality, he was very concerned with the ways in which, for instance, in the Victorian period, we actually see, in some ways, it becomes worse for homosexuals than it was before, because it starts to be treated in a scientific way, like it's a disease that can be cured, which would not have been the way it was viewed before. So, for instance, I read a really interesting work talking about women's friendships in the Victorian period, that were often highly romantic, but nobody saw it in that way. So nobody was trying to correct it. But coming into the Victorian period and beyond, we start to see everything's classified as normal or deviant, and so on. So I do think Foucault is bringing in some really interesting ways of interesting lenses for looking at our culture. And as I was talking about, we can think about the panopticon of the selfie and social media and the way we're constantly kind of thinking of ourselves and how other people are viewing us. We don't need anyone to discipline us because we're disciplining ourselves. So I think this has been a very generative theory, and it's inspired a lot of different ways of looking at this, at society.